Should I transition to the RIA channel at my multi-channel firm? That is today's question on the Transition to RIA question and answer series. Is episode number 104. Hi, I'm Brad Wales with Transition to RIA, where I help you understand everything there is to know about why and how to transition your practice to the RIA model. If you're not already there, if you start out by heading to transitiontoria.com, you can find all of the resources I make available from this entire series in video format, podcast format. I have articles, I have white papers, all kinds of things to help you better understand the RIA model. Again, transitiontoria.com. Okay, in today's episode, we're going to be talking about a question that I come across often in an advisor scenario that I come across often. And it's sometimes thought of, hey, should I make a quote unquote internal move within my firm to this RIA channel they have? So depending on what kind of firm you're at, maybe you're in a W-2 model or 1099 model, but you're at a so-called multi-channel firm, and examples of those are LPL, Raymond James, Wells Fargo, that have multiple affiliation channels. In one of those is the so-called RIA channel, or that's how it's sometimes expressed. And so advisors that are in other channels, again, W-2 or independent contractor, are saying, hey, maybe I want to transition my practice to that. Is that a good move for me to be making? And that's something that I help advisors with quite frequently. That's what we're going to be talking about on this episode here. So the first thing you want to kind of think through, and whenever I hear this question be asked, is exactly what are we referring to when we say the RIA channel of maybe your multi-channel firm? And the reason I say that is because I hear it used referring to different things. So I just want to give you a couple examples of what some of those flavors are, and then clarify what I'm going to be talking about on this episode. And then we're going to dive into some details of that. So in some instances, firms will refer to their RIA channel as their corporate RIA offering, which I've done a whole separate episode on what is a corporate RIA. But for most of you, if you're at a traditional quote unquote broker dealer and you're already offering fee-based accounts to your clients, you are already under some flavor of a corporate RIA now. And so just be careful. Sometimes firms want to position that as, oh, that's our RIA channel, because the reality is you are under an RIA in that. So they could call it the RIA channel, but it's typically not what advisors are thinking when they're talking about, oh, hey, I want to move to the RIA channel, but it might be what their firm is referring to. So keep that in mind. Now, kind of a variation of that I sometimes hear it been referenced as the RIA channel is where a firm, again, is referring to their corporate RIA, but some firms have grown to now where they do have essentially a channel offering that says, hey, you can be under our corporate RIA and not have any tie to our adjacent broker dealer. And so you are going to drop your 7, you're going to drop the broker dealer, you're going to drop FINRA. You are going to be, as they say, IAR only under the corporate RIA. And so I've heard some firms that will refer to that as their RIA channel, when in reality it's essentially often not a whole lot different than what the advisor might have now. It just so happens to be they're kind of fully breaking away from the broker-dealer side of things, and they're going IAR only in that capacity. And then you also see some firms that kind of their so-called hybrid solution. And you've heard me probably rant on a couple of episodes. I've done specific episodes on what is hybrid. That's another buzzword. You got to be careful because it's used in different capacities by different firms about a so-called hybrid solution. And you have to understand exactly whoever's using that term, exactly what model they are referring to. And so even in that quote unquote hybrid model, that could be a version of their so-called RIA channel where, hey, you come under our, again, corporate RIA. Oh, hey, you do have broker-dealer assets or commission assets. And so you can use our broker-dealer for that. And the reality is that's pretty much describing oftentimes what we think of as that independent broker-dealer channel. But next thing you know, we're calling it the RIA channel. We're calling it the hybrid channel. So again, you got to be careful of exactly what is being referred to in that regard. But the kind of flavor of RIA channel that we're going to be talking about today's episode, and what most advisors that are reaching out to me are what they are referring to, and again, their firm might be using different language, is where they are at a firm that has a custodial channel. So that firm might have a W-2 employee channel, might have a 1099 independent contractor channel, might have other channels, but they also have a custodial channel. And so that advisor's reaching out thinking, okay, hey, if I wanted to leave the channel I'm in now, start my own RIA, but instead of taking my assets and my clients elsewhere, I'm going to make the so-called internal move over to the custodial channel that my firm already has now. And maybe that's the best path for me. And again, that's what we're going to be diving into here today about, is that a good path? Should that be what you're considering? Pros, cons, those sorts of things. And then just the one last thing I'd put kind of from a definition standpoint, we're going to be talking about that custodial channel. There are some solutions out there that essentially position their offering as a custodial offering, but the reality is that firm is not self-clearing. So the reality is they're kind of calling it this RA channel, this custodial channel, but they are not the underlying custodian that is holding the assets. There's kind of a further step to it. So just again, I'm not trying to belabor this point, but just know that there's all kinds of different ways this so-called RIA channel can be referred to, and some very specifically might not be to your advantage. And so you want to understand what that is. And that's just an example. It's not to say a firm that's not self-clearing is automatically not going to be a good solution for you, but that is a fundamentally different approach and model, and perhaps have ramifications for you than a solution that is self-clearing. So something to be aware of. But again, on this episode, we're primarily talking about that advisor that's looking to make that internal move to that custodial channel with their firm. So two kind of related challenging scenarios I also want to discuss briefly here. I could probably do a whole separate episode on these, but I encounter this quite frequently, and these are often thought of, and rightfully so, as some sort of internal transition to that custodial channel. And so two possible pathways. One, you might be at, and this is generally independent broker-dealers, at perhaps a small or mid-sized independent broker-dealer that is not large enough to be self-clearing. So they are relying on a different clearing firm. The two biggest players in that space are NFS, which is Fidelity, and Pershing. So you might be at a broker-dealer now, but the assets are technically at, again, either like an NFS or a Pershing underneath it. And that you might want to leave that broker-dealer, say, hey, I want to start my own RIA, but I like Fidelity or Pershing. I like where my assets are. Ideally, I would like to keep my assets there. That is a flavor of that internal transition. And that is a challenge for a couple different reasons. Again, I won't go too far in here because I could make a whole episode out of it. But at the high level, the reason it's a challenge is, as the custodian, that custodian's main client in that whole relationship is not you, the individual advisor. It is the broker-dealer you work for. Again, they are a clearing firm for your broker-dealer, and your broker-dealer is a much larger client to them than you are individually. So if you want to reach out and say, oh, hey, I want to leave my broker-dealer, which, by the way, is oftentimes a very large client of the clearing firm, and I want to start my own RA and I'd like to keep my assets with you, while that custodian is obviously in the business of keeping assets, it does put them in a jam because they don't want to give any impression that they are doing anything to facilitate kind of stealing away, if you will, advisors from their large broker-dealer client and accommodating them still on the platform. So that's a challenging situation I come across all the time with advisors we try to work through. And again, it's challenging for custodians as well. So just know, if you're at a broker-dealer, it's not self-clearing, and you think, oh, I just want to make an internal transition with my own RA and keep the assets here, it's not necessarily a simple process to that. And then a similar example, I said there are kind of two challenges along this lines, is if you are with some RIA now that's not your RIA, and obviously that RIA has one custodian, perhaps multiple custodians, and you say, hey, I want to break away, start my own RIA. Again, I like the custodian I've been using, and I would just as well like to continue using them, keep my own assets, but I want to do it under my own RIA. Again, that's the same challenge the custodian has. They would love to keep your business. They do need to honor the relationship they have with your current RIA and not give the impression they're going behind that RIA's back to try to help you and kind of facilitate some sort of exit. And so it does create some challenges. All custodians tend to handle this different. So just the main takeaway there, and then we'll move on, is if you're at some broker-dealer, you're at some RIA that clears through, again, a clearing firm or a custodian, you want to keep your assets there, just know that's not just a snap your fingers and it's all going to be even available to you, let alone easy to make happen. That's something I'm happy to have a conversation with you about if you're in that situation, but just something to be aware of. Okay, now we're moving on. So if we're talking about, we're going to take those two challenging situations out. We're going to say you're at one of these multi-channel firms. Perhaps you're in the W-2 channel, or you're in the 1099 independent contractor channel, and you want to make that internal move. So a couple thoughts on that. Number one, your firm as a whole, again, with the multiple channels, they might express publicly and privately, oh, yes, we allow our advisors to make moves within these channels, but make no mistake, they would prefer you not do that. So, or not move to the custodial channel under your own RIA, regardless of the wordsmithing that is put into public press releases or the executives up on stage and how they express this, whatever the case is. Make no mistake, if you're an advisor and you're in a W-2 channel or that 1099 essentially independent broker-dealer channel, they will make certainly more revenue and more income off you as opposed to you sliding over to that custodial channel with your practice that's just due to the economics of how these different models work. And so they're not going to be excited about this. Now, at the end of the day, they might not stop you from doing it, and that might be part of their value prop is, hey, we allow advisors to make this move, but they're not going to be bending over backwards to make this possible, to help you with the steps and all that sort of thing. So just at least appreciate, and you can understand their situation, hey, we're not gaining any new clients, new assets here, but now all of a sudden, we're new advisors. Now we're going to make less revenue and less income than we did before, so they might allow it. They're not going to get excited about it, as opposed to if you were from some external firm and you were looking at their solution. Obviously, that's a whole different story because you're bringing entirely new revenue, new income, new assets to the firm. So it's looked at entirely different. So at least go into it knowing the perspective that the firm's going to have regarding that. Now, even with that, it is what it is. Making that internal move is generally as I say, the easier glide path on that transition. And so a couple things by what I mean by that. It's an easier story to perhaps tell clients. They are already familiar with the firm you are at now. And so if you were to make that move over to the custodial channel, even though you might have to explain to clients kind of what you're doing, why you're doing this. I did a whole episode on how to explain the RA model to clients. But the underlying assets are still at that same firm that the clients are familiar with. So the story is arguably a little easier to tell and explain to clients. Another example, when you make that internal transition, the paperwork involved is generally easier than if you were to go elsewhere entirely. In some, but not all instances, you avoid an ACAT process of having to move the accounts elsewhere. Even though nowadays with the right technology, ACAT and accounts elsewhere is significantly easier than it once was. But typically, again, not always, but typically that internal transition, you can avoid the ACAT, but there still is paperwork involved. It's not just flipping a switch and everything just instantly moves. There is still paperwork involved, but it's often less than if you were to move to an external solution altogether. So that's often an appealing part of why advisors look at this. But a thing I often challenge advisors to do is say, okay, hey, that might be the move you end up making, and I get it. It is the easier glide path initially. There are reasons that might be attractive to you initially, but what I say is, hey, at least step back, understand the competitive landscape of custodial solutions, and just ask yourself, hey, if I wasn't already at this firm, so maybe I'm at a wirehouse. That wirehouse does not have essentially a custodial option, or most of them don't at least. And I was just going out there and saying, okay, what are my options for my practice? Would you choose your firm's custodial channel as the landing spot if you had to move your assets regardless? Because you're at some firm, doesn't have an internal solution. you have to move. So you're going to go out there and say, okay, what's best for my practice? And that's what I encourage advisors to do, is at least understand what that is. And then now that might be, you might say, wow, even if I was external and look at what my firm offers in their custodial channel, that is where I'd want to go. And if that's the case, that's a wonderful pairing, if you will, because hey, it's going to be the easier glide path, and that's the solution you would have arguably picked anyways. But if it's not, and you say, wait, wow, all other things equal, I probably maybe would have gone with this solution over here. That still might not convince you to do that, but at least you can kind of know where the gap is between what your internal transition or internal solution is and what else is available. And perhaps that competitive gap is narrow enough that it doesn't overcome, again, the easier glide path, or perhaps going through that process, you realize, well, maybe I am better off looking at some external solutions, and maybe I need to seriously consider that. So I would say run that exercise. If you weren't already preconceived or had a preconceived idea that you're going to do just the internal transition, which would you go to otherwise? And then I also encourage you, if you look at that kind of internal move to the custodial channel, just like any custodial offer, and they will have to price out the custodial services for your RIA. And so they'll do a profile of your practice, the kind of assets you hold, the kind of the amount of cash you have, do you use lending? I've done an episode on how a custodian generates revenue if you want to kind of dive deeper into that. So they will look at that, and then typically they'll put some sort of pricing package together for you as the custodian to enter into a custodial agreement with your future RIA. And I would just encourage you, whatever they give back to you, hopefully it's a competitive package, but make sure that is the same package that they would offer someone coming from another firm with your same practice profile and join in the firm. Say, hey, okay, whatever you're going to offer me as the internal person or internal move with my size and my client base and my asset positions and blah, 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 is this the same pricing package you would have offered someone coming from maybe a wirehouse externally to you? And the reality is it should be the same. But again, the challenge is the firm is not as excited about you because you're making that internal transition. If anything, you're making less money, less revenue, less income for them. Whereas that solution coming from external is entirely fresh new assets. I get it. That's business. They're trying to grow. There's nothing wrong with that. But I also feel strongly they should not discriminate against you, particularly if they freely express, oh, we have these multiple channels and you can move however you want. If that's the case, you should not be at a disadvantage of what you're offered just because you happen to be coming internally versus the same practice profile of someone coming externally. So I would ask about that. Whatever your price, I'll say, hey, is this what I would have been offered if I was coming from external? And if it's not, you need to understand why and understand if that's a fair variance that they are giving you versus someone else. So kind of two takeaways I would just say from this exercise. Or maybe three. The first is, for better or worse, maybe you kind of realize now this is perhaps a little more complicated topic than it first seems. And someone says, oh, I want to go to the RIA channel. Again, do we even understand what definition of RIA channel we're referring to in that capacity? And then there's all these different scenarios, again, of if you're at a firm that's already using that custodian, or whatever the case is. So just know that it's probably more complicated than you realize. I'm not trying to discourage anyone, but it does take, you need to put in the effort to understand it and understand specifically to your scenario with your practice profile to be able to make sure you're making a good decision. So that's kind of number one. Number two is careful to not let a short-term decision overrule a long-term decision. And so what I mean by that is as you pick a custodian, and one day you might be multi-custodial, I've done episodes on that, but initially you generally always going to have one when you're launching an RIA. You are very unlikely to a degree to move your assets unless you get very frustrated with that custodian. So this is a very long-term decision you are making about what custodian you go with. And so I argue, just because it's the easier glide path in the near term, the short term, be careful. And I get it. It is the easier glide path. But are you letting a short-term decision, the ease of that glide path, drive what is ultimately a long-term decision? As long as your firm's custodial solution is a good solution for you long-term, then you're fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But if it's not, and you're choosing that solution solely because it's the easier kind of near-term process, I just would challenge you to think long and hard about that, because you're going to be in this for a very long time, and likely with that custodian. So just something to think about. And then the final takeaway, in part based on what I just said, and how some advisors kind of try to thread that needle, is I have seen advisors that say, hey, you know what, maybe my firm's custodial channel is not my ideal solution, my ideal partner long-term, but it is what it is. It's the easier glide path. I gotta get my new world figured out here. I'm gonna have new different responsibilities. I gotta be in charge of the compliance, the regulatory stuff of this new RIA. So what I'm gonna do, and I encourage advisors to consider this, there's nothing wrong with this, is hey, maybe you do this as a two-step process. So you say, okay, hey, step one, I am gonna do that internal transition. I am gonna take the easier glide path. I am gonna go to my existing firm's custodial channel. And after the dust settles, after I kind of get my new world figured out, I might then add another custodian. Again, as an RIA, you can be multi-custodial. Again, check out episodes I've done on that. Or even possibly replace your existing custodian that you're initially transitioning into. But unlike where most transitions, where it's a rip the Band-Aid, everything has to be done at once, one of the beauties is in the RIA space is if you have one custodian, you can add another custodian and have them both simultaneously, and then to the degree you want, essentially slowly move accounts if you were inclined to do that to the other one. Or you might simply add another custodian and say, hey, all new assets are going to go over here unless my initial or primary custodians are often referred to, kind of makes it worth my while to continue to build my assets here. So there are some strategies that even if you're inclined to ultimately have maybe some other custodial solution, either in its entirety over your current firm's custodial path, or as a complement to it, you could do that all at once as part of a transition, or you could look at maybe a two-step approach to it. So that's a sort of conversation I have with advisors often as well. So with that, I hope this episode has been helpful, not to add confusion to the process, but just know there's a lot of variables involved, even when it involves a so-called internal transition at your current firm. There's still a lot of things that you need to be thinking through as you evaluate what's going to be best for your practice going forward. So with that, like I said at the top, my name is Brad Wales with Transition to RIA. This is the kind of conversation I have with advisors all day long. Whether you want to talk about today's topic or anything else, there's all kinds of things that you need to be potentially considering about whether the RIA model is even a fit for your practice to begin with, let alone all these decisions that go into actually transitioning your practice to it. First things first, though, as I said before, head on over to transitiontoria.com where you can find all of the resources I make available. Again, this entire series in video format, podcast format. I have articles, I have white papers, and at the top of every page is a contact link. You click on that, you can instantly and easily schedule time to have a one-on-one conversation with me, whether you want to talk about today's topic or anything else RIA related. I'm happy to have that conversation with you. Again, transitiontoria.com. And with that, I hope you found value on today's episode, and I'll see you on the next one.